Welcome to the California Poor People's Campaign welcome session for March. Generally, we're doing these on the first Tuesday of the month. So that's today, March 2nd. And we'll be starting shortly. People are still arriving. And we've asked people to introduce themselves in the chat with your name, your preferred pronouns, and your location. And by the way, I'm Nell Myhand, and I use she and her pronouns. And I am located on Huichin Ohlone land, which is also known as Oakland. And I have the honor of serving as a co-chair for the California campaign, and also I'm part of the Bay Area Regional Steering Committee. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everyone. So we still have people coming in, but I think we're probably about ready to start with the March welcome session to the California Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And so for those of you who just arrived into the room, we've invited people to introduce themselves with their name, their preferred pronouns, and where they're located. And with that, hope we're ready to start. Reverend Rowan, are we ready to start?
Oh, sorry. You want me to jump right in? Sorry. Welcome. I'm going to share my screen. Welcome to the California Poor People's Campaign. We're really glad you're here. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. It's an incredibly rich topic. And in this introductory meeting, I'm going to first give you some background on the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, and then bring you up to date on the modern campaign. Since we're hoping you'll want to join us, I'll also spend a little time on organizational information, as well as explaining a bit about poverty measures and other issues that will be helpful for you to understand. Then you'll hear about our recent state and local work and opportunities to jump right in. In 1967-68, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights leaders, and others came together to forge a campaign to bring national attention to the unjust economic traditions facing millions of people worldwide. Dr. King emphasized the need for poor whites, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans to unite into a new and unsettling force. He asserted that the Poor People's Campaign would only be successful if the poor could come together across all the obstacles and barriers set up to divide them, and if they could demand the attention and resources being diverted because of the US engagement in the Vietnam War. Let's take a moment to focus on one of the most important tenets of the Poor People's Campaign: respect poor people. Dr. King and others who were involved in the campaign in the early days were not only proposing new government policies, they were calling for a radical transformation of society that rested on these key insights that reflect the tenet of respecting the poor, as you can read on the screen here. The commitment to bring people together forms the core of the work and the principles of the 1968 campaign and of the modern campaign. Drawing a critical mass of people into the campaign has been a guiding principle since the earliest days, right up until the present. The Poor People's Campaign began in Washington, where key leaders of the campaign gathered for lobbying efforts and media events before dispersing around the country to formally launch the 9 regional caravans, bringing thousands of participants to Washington. The Eastern Caravan, the Appalachian Trail,
Kirsten,
the
you
Southern
okay?
Caravan,
Okay.
the Midwest Caravan, the Indian
Did you
Trail,
get your
the
puzzle
San
done?
Francisco Caravan, the
Oh,
Western
okay.
Caravan.
You're doing
I'm
kitties?
sorry, if somebody could mute themselves, that would probably
No
be a
kitties,
really
huh?
good plan. Unless you're trying to talk to me, and if so, I can't hear you. The San Francisco Caravan, the Western Caravan, the Mule Train, and the Freedom Train. The caravans were part of the campaign's plans for gaining significant public attention and support for its demands through 3 main strategies, including constructing a shanty town called Resurrection City on the National Mall between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, which was to house 1,500 to 3,000 campaign participants. Holding nonviolent civil disobedience and mass arrests to protest the plight of poverty in this country. Launching a nationwide boycott of major industries and shopping areas to promote business leaders to pressure Congress for meeting the demands of the campaign. These 2 photos are of the Mule Train, a caravan of about 15 covered wagons painted with slogans such as "Jesus was a poor man" and "Feed the poor," which came up from Marks, Mississippi. The vision was that this mule train would go all the way from Marks, Mississippi, the poorest hamlet in the poorest state in the country, all the way to Washington, says Georgetown University professor Cheryl Cushion, whose parents helped organize the mule train. The mule and the covered wagons were a symbolic message of the Black sharecropper. As a first step of building the power needed to achieve this goal of radical redistribution of political and economic power, Dr. King, along with other leaders of the poor, such as Johnny Tillman of the National Welfare Rights Organization, helped work out the major elements of the platform of the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. Those simple tenets of the campaign were feed the hungry, and the other things listed on this slide: respect poor people. I wonder how things would be 50 years later if these platform planks had been adopted. As the first public demonstration to launch the Poor People's Campaign on May 12th, Mother's Day, 1968, Coretta Scott King called for reform in social service funding with these words: "Congress passes laws which subsidize corporations, farms, oil companies, airlines, and houses for suburbia." But she pointed out it was unwilling to make similar investments to help the poor. This disparity in the distribution of government funds became and remains a key theme of the Poor People's Campaign. Along with Mrs. King, Ethel Kennedy, the wife of Robert Kennedy, led thousands through poor neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. for the Mother's Day March, organized by the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, headed by Dr. King, was the architect of the Poor People's Campaign. It created an economic bill of rights that included demands for living wages, secure incomes, access to land and capital, and a significant role for those most affected by government programs in determining the design and implication of those programs. These demands echoed a number of similar points in the Economic Bill of Rights for the American people outlined by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a radio address to the nation in January of 1944. The bill outlined by Roosevelt also included recognition of a right for jobs, adequate homes, decent housing, as well as rights to medical care, education, and the protection of older adults. Unfortunately, Roosevelt died 3 months later, and that bill was never implemented. Again, 1944, think where we could be today. In 1967, Bayard Rustin, a noted political strategist and a leader in social movements, was working for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He crafted the legislative proposals needed to implement the Bill of Economic and Social Rights. And those are reflected in a New York Times article in 1968. See them here. So this is a picture of Resurrection City. It was meant to evoke the conditions under US capitalism and racism. It housed more than 3,000 people, and demonstrations and solidarity visits drew many thousands more to the encampment during the 6 weeks of its existence, even had its own zip code. Residents braved torrential rains. Oh, if you look at it, torrential rains in determinable mud, undercover informants, and hostile police. Resurrection City programs, though, included a child care center, health and social service, a poor people's university with ongoing seminars and lectures, free meals, a daily newspaper, cultural activities in the Soul Center, a city council, a finance committee, and a public relations center. More than 55,000 people gathered on Solidarity Day, held on Juneteenth, in commemoration of the day when the Emancipation Proclamation made it to Texas 2.5 years after its passage. I have to show the diggers because, of course, they're local to me here in San Francisco. They gave away thousands of loaves of bread, mixed up in a garbage can and cooked in coffee and juice cans, hence the interesting shape of the loaf shown on the bread tent. The bread was sliced and served with margarine, honey, peanut butter, or jelly. One of the indigenous leaders at a 2020 Poor People's Campaign event said that it was the first time some of the citizens of Resurrection City had ever had wheat bread. Remember, this was in the days of Wonder Bread. He also said that for some folks who got shoes from the free store of the diggers, it was their first pair of shoes. So many people came to Washington, D.C. with the campaign, and there was quite a contingent of Native Americans. The unemployment rate on the Native reservations was 10 times higher than the national average in 1968, and as many as 60% of Native lived below the poverty line. Activist Melvin D. Tom, co-founder of the National Indian Youth Council in Berkeley, California, and a member of the Walker River Paiute tribe of Nevada, demanded of the Interior Department that they address Native rights to sovereignty and equality, economic opportunity, and Indian-run schools. Other Native activists who joined the Poor People's Campaign led unique protests within the largest demonstrations, including Hank Adams, Victor Charlo, Tilly Walker, and Maddie Grinnell. And I just have to share Maddie Grinnell. She was 101 years old at the time of this picture. She lived to be 108. She was from Fishhook Village in North Dakota. She's speaking outside the Supreme Court here, and as part of her work as a noted speaker and organizer for both the Poor People's Campaign and the American Friends Service Committee, she was granted her Civil War widow's pension, which she had been denied up to that point. I just love the sort of personal interest story there. But unfortunately, the unity and organization needed for the Poor People's Campaign of 1968 to complete its main strategies to form the new unsettling force to disrupt complacent national life and achieve the Economic Bill of Rights was not easy to come by. The assassinations of Dr. King in April and then the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy in June served to cripple the campaign and greatly limit its longevity. Senator Kennedy had been a key proponent of the campaign, and out of respect, his funeral procession passed through Resurrection City. So on June 19th, the campaign's Solidarity Day rally for jobs, peace, and freedom, over 55,000 people marched alongside the 3,000 participants living in Resurrection City. And this is the Ministers' March. You can see Ralph Abernathy holding the papers, and next to him is Mel Tom, the Native American I just mentioned. I'm not sure who the other folks in the picture are. But I don't want you to think that they went to all this work and nothing got done. So despite the setbacks due to political violence and assassinations, as well as the difficulties of sustaining a national movement, the Poor People's Campaign of 1968 nevertheless had an impact, not only on government policies, but also on public perceptions. The campaign pushed Congress and federal agencies to allocate millions for programs such as Head Start and education and welfare services for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, while it also helped catalyze the desegregation of schools and extensive labor programs. Significantly, the campaign introduced new strategies for protest and social change. The movement also helped transform national discussions on race, class, economic opportunity, security, and democracy. The year 1968 represented a transformative period in American history as the civil rights movement began addressing human rights issues across boundaries nationwide. And now we come to the modern campaign. And we aim to stand on the shoulders of those who came before and put effort into learning lessons and getting into step together. To give you a glimpse of the origins of the Modern Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, we'll start with the 2018 PBS video interview Judy Woodruff and Reverend Barber.
Next, an effort to revive a famous movement of the 1960s focused on reducing poverty, inequality, and tackling social justice. But with such a broad agenda, will it find enough support at this polarized time? We start with a look at the campaign that began 50 years ago. Shortly before his death in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. expanded his civil rights campaign to include calls for economic justice. He called for an economic revolution that included protection and services for the poorest Americans. He would call it the Poor People's Campaign.
We're coming to get our check.
The campaign would bring together poor people from across the country and from across racial, ethnic, and geographic lines, including poor whites, for a march on Washington.
Even if you have to bring a whole family, we're going to have in Washington facilities, and we're going to have food, and we are going to demand that the government do something about these conditions.
The first step was to construct a shanty town called Resurrection City on the National Mall, housing thousands of participants in a form of nonviolent civil disobedience. Dr. King himself would never make it to the March on Washington. He died that spring. But weeks after his assassination, 50,000 people gathered in solidarity, demanding economic reform on the steps where Dr. King had professed, "I have a dream."
We come with an appeal to open the doors of America to the almost 50 million Americans who have not been given a fair share of America's wealth and opportunity.
Half a century later, a group of religious and moral leaders are planning a wave of civil disobedience in Washington, a revival of the Poor People's Campaign. It is headed in part by the Reverend William Barber, who's the co-chair of the campaign. He led demonstrators at a rally in front of the U.S. Capitol this month, and he was arrested, alongside the Reverend Jesse Jackson, a key figure in the 1968 movement. I spoke with Reverend Barber recently when he was in Washington. Reverend William Barber, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you very much for joining us. When the original Poor People's Campaign took place, it was 50 years ago. Dr. Martin Luther King was involved. After he was assassinated, it continued. But what is the connection between then and now?
Well, thank you so much for having us. And on behalf of the campaign, the National Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival, and my co-chair, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, let me say that the connection was, first of all, that it did continue, that people realized Dr. King was right. Racism, poverty, and militarism were interconnected. The connection today is we did a study, we commissioned a study with the Institute for Policy Studies and also had some help with Urban Institute, anecdotal and empirical data. And we did something called the Souls of Poor Folk, auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign. What do we find? Today, there are 140 million poor and low wealth people. Today, there are 250,000 people that die every year from low wealth. We have less voting rights today because of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act than we had in 1965. We have 62 million people who are working poor, who work for less than a living wage, and 14 million children who are in poverty.
Those numbers are overwhelming. They are daunting. You're not proposing to do away with poverty, are you?
We are saying that there are 5 interlocking injustices that America has to face because they continue to cause policy violence. That is systemic racism, particularly seen through the lens of voter suppression, where people use voter suppression to get elected, and then once they get elected, they pass policies that hurt the poor, mostly white women, children, and the working poor. Systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy and militarism, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism that says you don't have to address those issues. We are saying, yes, America is going to have to face these 5 interlocking injustices and change them.
Why can't you work through the existing political system, work to elect political figures who agree with your agenda?
Well, several reasons. Number one, we had 26 presidential debates in the last presidential election. On the Democrat and Republican side, not 1 hour was spent on poverty. Not 1 hour was spent on voter suppression and restoring the Voting Rights Act. Not 1 hour on the war economy and militarism. So if we're not even having the conversation, the first thing we have to change is the attention violence. We have an attention violence when it comes to poverty and the poor, and we must change that before you can change the agenda. And it must be a movement of the people from the bottom up.
Reverend Barber, I talk to people, I've read folks who agree with much of what you are saying you want, but they also are saying you're asking for too many different things, that you should narrow your list of ambitions, that you'll have a much better chance at getting something done.
Well, then those same people should say narrow the Constitution because it's pretty ambitious. It says domestic tranquility, establishment of justice, providing for the common defense, promoting the welfare, general welfare. Narrow the moral call of the Bible that says you're supposed to care for the stranger, the hungry, the sick, the left out, the lonely, the imprisoned. Why is it that that wealthy and greed gets to ask for everything? They want tax cuts, they get that. They want to block health care, they get that. But then we tell poor people, you have to ask for one thing. 37 million people without health care, we have to fight for health care. Millions of people without living wages, we can't just ask for one thing because they are systemically interlocking injustices.
If there are so many who you define as poor in this country, why aren't we seeing more people rise up and make this argument? I mean, it's right now it's left to you and a relatively small group of people who are making this argument, having the march, having your demonstrations and so forth.
Well, I don't know if I would say a relatively small group. We have organizing committees in 40 states. We have people who are organizing. In the last 2 weeks, we've had thousands of people attend. Over nearly 2,000 people do civil disobedience, more than ever in the history of this country, simultaneously doing nonviolent moral fusion, civil disobedience. There is a rising, and why? And so what we're doing is we're launching a movement. We're not ending a movement. We're launching a movement and calling people to action. Many people do not know how bad it is, and many people who are poor and low wealth have been broken and pushed down and ignored. But where we're going from West Virginia to Wisconsin, from Alabama to Alaska, we're finding that there are thousands of people who are saying it's time for us to stand up and refuse to be silent.
You've said that the nation's problem is not that we don't have enough money. You said it's that we don't have the moral capacity to face what ails society. What did you mean by that?
That when you look at our deepest moral framework of the Constitution and our deepest moral values of our religious tradition, we too often have a political conversation that talks about left versus right, military or middle class. That's too puny, it's too narrow. 43.5% of this country is poor and low wealth. People are dying. Even Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, said the America has to face the cost of inequality. What I'm saying is we can't just have a left-right argument anymore. We need to have a deeply moral argument that says This is not just about Democrats or Republicans. This is about America. What kind of democracy do we want to be? You cannot have a democracy continue to exist when 400 people make an average of $97,000 an hour and you lock people up who simply want 15 in the union.
Does either political party come closer to your goals?
Well, I think they can. I think they hit at it. I think, of course, the extremists who have taken over the Republican Party have just gone so far extreme. You know, they're more focused on tax cuts to the wealthy. They want to blame poor people for their problems. Democrats, on the other hand, are willing to talk about, say, the Affordable Care Act and talk about the middle class. But the reality is neither party is willing to put right in front of America the issues of systemic racism, of systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and say the word poverty. It's almost as though we've tried to remove even saying the word poverty, when in fact the majority of the poor people in this country are white, women, children, working people, and the disabled. So we have to change our narrative in this country. And the only way you can change the narrative is to change the narrator. That's why this campaign is focused on three things: breaking through the narrative, massive voter mobilization among the poor, and power building from the bottom up.
Reverend William Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign in 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Next.
Okay, I'm always inspired by that. So Reverend Dr. Barber, whom you just saw, was the former president of the North Carolina NAACP, and he stepped forward to pick up the baton from Dr. King, and in 2018 became the co-chair of the Modern Poor People's Campaign. He has expressed admiration for the legacy of Dr. King's commitments to the interlocking injustices as a model for the intersectionality of the current campaign. As you will hear as you learn more about the campaign, these interlocking injustices include the evils of systemic racism, systemic poverty, the war economy, ecological devastation, and the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. Reverend Dr. Barber and allies in the Fusion movement sat in, protested, and were arrested for several years at the North Carolina State House as part of the Moral Mondays protests that began in April of 2013 with 100 participants, 17 of whom were arrested. As the movement built momentum, police pegged weekly attendance at more than 2,500. And in 2014, the Moral Monday movement gathered an estimated 80,000 for a march. More than 800 demonstrators were arrested over the course of the initial Moral Monday actions in North Carolina. In 2020, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, held virtual Facebook Live Moral Mondays with millions of people calling Mitch McConnell to ask for COVID relief. And in 2021, the virtual Moral Mondays events have resumed to galvanize support for the Biden administration to adopt the campaign's 14 policy principles to heal the nation. And here's a picture of those 80,000 people heading in the capital of North Carolina. So in 2015, Reverend Barber and others from the Moral Monday movement created Repairers of the Breach, dedicated to a moral agenda rooted in moral and constitutional values. On September 12, 2016, activists from Moral Monday and Repairers of the Breach, the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, labor organizers from Fight for 15, faith leaders like Sister Simone Campbell and the Nuns on the Bus, and religious and political groups across the nation organized a Moral Day of Action with simultaneous protests in 30 state capitals, including Sacramento, where many of us were. We delivered the Higher Ground Moral Declaration to our respective state elected officials. In 2016, Repairers of the Breach made a commitment to revive the Poor People's Campaign with a Cairo Center and hundreds of churches and grassroots organizations across the country. After jointly announcing the launch of the new Poor People's Campaign on December 4th, 2017, the co-chairs, Reverend Barber and Reverend Theo Harris, led hundreds in a silent, nonviolent march on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. to present a letter to then Senator Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, condemning a recently passed budget bill. Senator McConnell refused to meet with the marchers. So this is what we are. We're a fusion movement. We're not an organization. We're a movement building organism. We partner with others. We work together, and we're a movement that builds from the bottom up. If we lift from the bottom, everybody rises. And we're committed to confronting the interlocking evils. And that's who we are. Dr. Barber emphasizes that one cannot make demands without data. And so from the beginning, the Poor People's Campaign has undertaken and continues to conduct with partners extensive research to create accurate current information about poverty and the poor. You'll find all these studies and research documents downloadable on the campaign's website. The Souls of Poor Folk Moral Audit provided a data-driven analysis of the historical and empirical realities of the four evils that Dr. King mentioned, brought up to date with the last 50 years. The 7 sections of the moral budget, which was delivered to the Congressional Budget Committee in 2019. We look at the policies and investments for 7 critical areas on our agenda: democracy and equal protection under the law, domestic tranquility, peace and a common defense, life and health, the planet, our future, and an equitable economy. In 2020, the campaign produced a report entitled Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low-Income Americans, which provided a closer look at the voting behaviors of millions of people relative to the size of the total electorate, as well as recent voting margins by state. These findings support the campaign's analysis that organizing among the poor around an agenda that represents their concerns can fundamentally change the political map of this country and lead to policies that are just and representative for all Americans. Because the moral budget is such a cornerstone of the vision of the Poor People's Campaign, it's important to understand how poverty is measured and who is defined as poor. When the Poor People's Campaign talks about poverty, we support the use of the supplemental policy measure, not the older official poverty measure, because it better represents the actual level of poverty in America. Given the US population is estimated at slightly higher than 300 million, the fact that 140 million of our people are poor, this is before COVID, means that more than 40% of the population lives in poverty. The information shown here on poverty and low income status of First Nations, Native Americans, Native Alaskans, LGBTQIA, and disabled people is scant under the supplemental poverty measure. Existing information from the official poverty measure puts the levels of poverty in these communities at a lower percentage than shown. However, as mentioned previously, the official poverty measure is limited and outdated, so its statistics do not reflect the full scale of poverty in these communities. Also, transgender people are likely to experience poverty at a rate double the national population, while transgender people of color are experiencing even higher poverty rates. This is a picture from one of our bus tours, and I will show you a video from the repairers of the breach about our campaigns. So I think here, part of grassroots organizing is to go out and listen to the people who are most affected by the policies that keep poor people down. The Poor People's Campaign has taken to bus tours to engage their supporters and form state organizing committees. This video of the 2019 Truth and Poverty bus tour from Repairers of the Breach illustrates the testimonies received during these tours.
What happens in Wall Street often doesn't say a thing about what's happening on the real streets of America.
Well, there are thousands who are not free. And we know when one person is not free, none of us are free. And we know that this isn't the case in God's economy. It doesn't have to be this way. We can do better.
We can do better! We can do better!
In America, we are taught that if you are poor, if you are homeless, if you are dispossessed, disenfranchised, it's because you've done something wrong. It's because you are inferior. It is because you are insufficient. And we believe that that is wrong. There are 140 million people in the United States who either live in poverty or are low income, who are one paycheck away from being homeless. or one wildfire away from being homeless, or one missed rent check or car payment away from being homeless. That's over a third of the United States. Now, to me, that is our deep shame as a country. That is a moral emergency, and that's why we need a Poor People's Campaign across the entire nation. We are identifying ourselves with this movement. And what that means is we're saying, hey, we're part of something bigger.
I understand some things about poverty because I am a poor person. We believe that when poor people name their own priorities because they know their own needs and know what needs to happen, that real change will be produced. If poor people are not allowed to speak these priorities for themselves, no one else will.
It's hard enough just to live on this earth and survive. And it shouldn't make it any more difficult. You shouldn't be homeless and be a criminal just because you're homeless. That's right. It's sad. Sad.
The homelessness that you're seeing in the streets of LA, in our community, you can see it all up and down the state. People encamped in the streets, living in their cars, in RVs, in garages. It's a growing phenomenon. And one thing that's important for me to point out, I don't think this is because people just don't know how to manage their finances. This is an economic devastation based on a systemic root.
We thought we were going off to be heroes. But what we found was that we are no more than pawns. And when we come home to live in an unjust and unequal society with the largest prison complex in the world and a political system that seeks to oppress voting rather than to expand it.
It's got to be done to help people with disabilities to vote. One of my concerns is when I went to vote, when the little sheet came out of the thing that showed what I voted for, I couldn't read it. It was in small print.
Let the people vote! That's how you honor veterans.
I get tired of hearing a certain false narrative. And it's that people like myself are weak, lazy, and immoral. But this is far from the truth because weak, lazy, and immoral is letting human beings live in the streets while billionaires receive trillion-dollar tax cuts.
Come on now. Come on now.
Denying health care to millions, cutting social services for the poor, and privatizing the VA while dropping bombs on brown people 1,000 miles away, diverting money from poor Americans to pay for those bombs and lying for the reasons why the bombs are even being dropped, caging immigrant children,
Come on, Mike.
ignoring ecological devastation in poor communities is weak, lazy, and immoral.
This was the site of the first of the 3 major fires that Lewiston experienced in 2013. They were all arson, and there was a lot of agreement that the fires themselves were tragic, but it surfaced this ongoing tension that we have in the community over, who we consider to be a part of our community. And many times it's not even coded. It's literally, we have too many immigrants, their homes burnt down, so let's not rebuild them because, we need less people like that here.
Look at everything the United States is doing. Look at all the wealth. That's all ours. I mean, that's all the Native American. It's easy to lose that focus because everybody came in that second chapter. But they got to go to the first chapter. The first chapter is going to tell the story of this country. And then Congress or nobody can turn away from it. So, this Poor People's Campaign needs to know that they have artillery, religious artillery that can help the movement. But if you don't recognize us, then it goes back to that second chapter that we're the forgotten ones.
There are currently more than 11,000 unaccompanied children in the care of the U.S. and Humane Services. This policy is inhumane, it is immoral. To remain silent is to be complicit.
There is no individual solution to the social and economic problems that working women face.
We do not live in a mom-friendly or child-friendly country. We face inadequate paid paternity leave, abysmal postpartum health care, and equally appalling access to quality child care and public education. I feel expendable, but if I am expendable, so too are children, and that I cannot stand for.
So we have to hold these politicians accountable. That's where our problem is. In St. John, people are not participating in these elections. because these people who we elect, they are not representing us.
There's other systems here that are oppressing us that voting won't always fix, and that we've got to talk about, we've got to call it out, and we've got to mobilize and build a movement to be able to change these things that our politicians won't always change.
But I have to tell you, there's something going on in this nation right now. There's a beautiful birth of a movement, and it's gonna take all of us. It's gonna take all of us to stand up and say, I lived at a time when kids were going hungry and homeless, when they were closing hospitals and healthcare centers, when racists were emboldened. But I linked arms with people. I stood up and acted for justice, and we changed it. We changed it.
Forward together! Not one step back.
It's movement time. It's time to shake this nation, because this nation is locked up. Our politics are small and bang, but we are those who can see the cracks in the walls and the way to come out of the cells. And we are determined to be free. And we're determined to see other folk free. Free with living wages, right? Free. Free with health care. Free. Free with food on their tables, and free with good housing, and free with good water and land and air, and free with justice. That is the call of this movement. And we are the front line.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want?
What happens in...
Okay, so the last of the state listening campaigns was called the MORE Tour. We must do MORE, which was mobilizing, organizing, registering, and educating. It was designed not only to register voters, but also to mobilize new and existing campaign supporters to commit to its aims and principles. This national tour kicked off in June 2019 and was meant to be ongoing until May 2020. Our wonderful December 2019 tour stop in San Francisco was one of the last live events, however. In the initial chaos of the pandemic, 4 states had their tour stops canceled. But soon the campaign took to Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and Zoom. Local problems were highlighted by virtual tour stops with local testifiers and leaders. Recordings of the Facebook Live feeds are available on the National Campaign's Facebook page. And these are some pictures I took of the San Francisco MORE Tour. So in 2019, there was a Poor People's Campaign Moral Action Congress. And the first day had a presidential forum where many of the Democratic candidates joined us. None of the Republicans did. And they mostly agreed with our demands about healthcare, the Voting Rights Act, universal pre-K and affordable childcare, a $15 minimum wage, and the myth that we have scarcity of resources. We can't do the things we want to do. And so that was pretty heartening. And then the next day we took the moral budget, not me. I was one of the people staying at Trinity Washington University watching it on the big screen as our delegation presented this to the Congressional Budget Committee, and also to Speaker Pelosi, who, even though she wasn't on the Budget Committee, asked for permission to join them and to listen to our appeal. So that was also very heartening. So the moral budget emphasizes that poverty is caused by structures and immoral policies, and therefore it will take moral policies and a larger social transformation to lift the load of poverty. And here's some pictures of our testifiers and the Congressional Budget Committee. Okay, since you want to join us, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we're structured. We're a joint project of Repairs of the Breach and the Kairos Center, And so staff from those nonprofits are the only paid people working on the campaign, and they manage the national campaign, coordinating events, policies, and other activities. Reflecting the campaign's commitment to its moral fusion principles, there are coordinating committees at the state level, and each includes an impacted person, a faith leader, and an organizer. In California, we're so big, our state committee has an additional member, so we have quad chairs instead of tri-chairs. We also have several regional steering committees in addition to our state coordinating committee. And this regional steering committees are San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, Inland Empire, Sacramento, Orange County, and San Diego. Working groups address various interest areas and aspects of the interlocking issues of the campaign from the national level to the states. And these on the list of working groups are some of the ones that are available across the state and in some of the local steering committees. So a key part of the foundation of the Poor People's Campaign is moral fusion organizing. This concept is distinct from hierarchy-based organizations that depend on the leadership of one single leader or group. Reverend Barber also put forward the 14 steps of moral fusion organizing in the Third Reconstruction, written by Reverend Barber and with Jonathan Wilson Hargrove. America's Third Reconstruction depends on a moral movement deeply rooted in the South, emerging state by state throughout the nation. All 14 principles can be seen on the website listed here, but diversity and inclusion are not empty words for the Poor People's Campaign. They are fundamental to all aspects of our approach to moral fusion organizing. The campaign, a broad, indigenously led grassroots coalition, includes moral and religious leaders and people of all faiths, as well as those who profess no faith, people of all races and sexual orientations. It promotes the use of moral language to frame and critique public policy, regardless of who is in power. Most importantly, it aims to amplify the voices of everyday people who are impacted by immoral policies. These are a few of the basic principles of moral fusion organizing. So read the full list on repairs of the breach. So our goals are pretty simple. We want to change the narrative by changing the narrator. We want to have an impact in our country. We want to build power among the poor and low wealth people. And here are what we consider to be the real moral issues of our day. It's not who you sleep with. It's not whether you get an abortion. It's whether you can vote, whether you have health care, housing, education, sovereignty, a living wage, and the right to unionize, a clean environment to raise your children in, and an end to gun proliferation and warmongering. On this slide, you'll see the condensed version of the 12 foundational principles of the Poor People's Campaign. We often read these principles at the beginning of various meetings, so you'll see them again and you can read them on the website. Please note the last principle on the list, embrace nonviolence, because it is particularly important for folks considering joining the campaign. The Covenant of Nonviolence is more than a document to sign when engaging in direct action. It is an ideal woven through the principles of the campaign, especially because others may try to disrupt and weaken the nonviolence of our work. This means it is imperative to the strength and success of the Poor People's Campaign that we maintain nonviolent unity, discipline, and rigor, tapping into a power and soul force that exists within each of us. Okay, so we'll shift gears a bit. Again, when you join the campaign, what kinds of things might you be working on next? I mentioned earlier that one of our documents is the Poor People's Moral Justice Jubilee Platform, which forms the basis for our current work. I'll show a video from the Cairo Center about the Jubilee Platform and then show you what the sections and principles are. Let me briefly explain the meaning of the word Jubilee for those who might be unfamiliar with the term. In Judaism, a Jubilee year is a year of emancipation of slaves and prisoners, forgiveness of debts, restoration of alienated lands to their former owners, and a rest from cultivation for the land itself. In ancient Hebrew law, a Jubilee year was kept every 50 years. The Catholic Church has a Jubilee year every 25 years for remission of sins and universal pardon. In an interfaith context, Jubilee is most often used about debt relief. The Parliament of the World's Religions in 2004 called for the world to declare Jubilee and relieve the burden of international debt on our poor neighbors. The Poor People's Campaign Jubilee platform can be heard in this context.
From Alaska to Arkansas, the Carolinas to California, Mississippi to Maine, Kansas to Kentucky, the Bronx to the border, Appalachian Hollers to Apache sacred lands, people are coming together to organize their moral outrage against systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and the war economy, and the false narrative of religious nationalism into a powerful moral fusion movement.
There are 140 million people who are poor and struggling against these injustices in the richest country in the world. A society sick with these injustices needs a voice rooted in our deepest moral and constitutional values to remind us of who we are and who we must be.
A moral policy agenda to heal the nation. The Poor People's Jubilee platform proclaims that moral policy is economically sound policy. That the 140 million are not only the hope of the poor, that the least of these, who are in actuality most of us, can lead the nation out of the pain that it's been feeling.
The rejected are leading a moral and economic revival to save the heart and soul of this nation. Our platform is grounded in 5 principles.
We need a moral revolution of values to repair the breach in our society. This platform abides by our deepest constitutional and moral commitments to justice. Where harm has been done, it must be acknowledged and undone.
Everybody in, nobody out. Too many people are hurting, and we can't be silent anymore.
When you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. Instead of trickle down, we start with bottom up.
Prioritize the leadership of the poor, low income, and most impacted. Those who are on the front lines of these crises must also be in the lead in identifying their solutions.
Debts that cannot be paid must be relieved. We demand freedom from servicing debts that cannot be paid.
The Poor People's Jubilee platform now identifies policy and legislative priorities to heal our nation.
We've been investing in punishing the poor, but we must now invest in the welfare of all. We've been investing in systemic racism and voter suppression, but we must now invest in expanding democracy.
We have been investing in killing people. We now must invest in life.
We have been investing in the wealthy and corporations. We must now invest in the people who have built up this country and make it run every day. The 140 million and more who have been abandoned in an era of abundance.
Somebody's been hurting our people, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore.
We won't be silent anymore.
Not be silent anymore.
Okay, so I think that those folks on the video gave you a really good idea about what the Jubilee platform is about. So I'm going to just sort of go through these slides because we're kind of running out of time. So I'm going to move on to the kinds of things that you might find yourself involved in. And this visual, we see people from all over California who submitted pictures of themselves holding individual letters to spell out the phrase, "Everybody's got a right to live," a declaration that is a core message of the campaign, as well as the chorus of one of the songs that is sung at rallies and gatherings. You may be asked at some point to submit a photo with a letter to help with our messaging. Seeing many people's faces supporting our messages has a special magic. Here's another state action. There was a bill coming up that would have allowed oil producers not to be accountable to clean up their wells. And so we joined as the campaign with environmentalists all over the state to try and stop it getting signed into law. We had 20,000 door hangers with census information and voter information in English and Spanish that were distributed across California by many, many volunteers, some of whom are shown here. Our most recent state event was regarding the false moral narrative of religious nationalism, one of our 5 interlocking evils. When Christian nationalist Sean Foyt proposed a large-scale worship protest event without requiring participants to wear masks or maintain social distance, the California Poor People's Campaign swung into action to support the Los Angeles Poor People's Group and to demand the Los Angeles mayor and board of supervisors, as well as Governor Newsom, take legal steps to prevent the gathering. The campaign also hosted a Facebook Live meeting attended by some of the 60+ faith leaders who had signed a statement drafted by the California campaign that spoke out against Foyt's actions. And the campaign supported a car caravan blockade organized by the Church Without Walls and LA Can, where 100 cars blocked a small Foyt gathering. Though Foyt's larger events were not canceled, he was forced to move them from their original location just blocks from Skid Row, where the crowds would have posed a public health threat to the unhoused people in the area. The campaign helped generate negative publicity around Foyt's events that have sparked an online conversation that continues even now as he travels across the country doing these events. Here's a Sacramento action that took place not very long ago in Sacramento. No more homeless deaths. They had a die-in. Here are some photos, including Faye Wilson Kennedy holding up someone that they lost on the lower corner there. And here's a Los Angeles action. Kenya Alcocer posted, who is in the upper right of those pictures, is they had a rent strike. It's even before COVID, they were fighting for fair rents, and now they're really fighting for fair rents. The Bay Area campaign has been supporting a strike at a McDonald's on Telegraph in Oakland repeatedly because the conditions of work there have been appalling. We also worked with a lot of other groups to do a huge mural in front of the federal building in Oakland that's Stop the Coup, to try and get our communities organized, strong-hearted, and ready to take positive action to stop a possible coup attempt during the November elections, just weeks before the assault on the US Capitol. And just this past weekend, the Bay Area Poor People's Campaign joined a climate justice street mural building again in front of the federal building in Oakland. And this is our image and some of our team who worked on doing it. And so here are some of the things that are happening right now. Please consider signing our Move On petition. Support our 14 policy priorities, which you can find on the website. If you have lost someone to COVID, honor them on our memorial wall, and come on Mondays at noon our time to Moral Mondays, which are both an opportunity for education and an opportunity for action. We have testifiers on whatever the theme is that week. This week it was on environment, and we heard from people on reservations and people in Cancer Alley. talking about why the environmental part of the Poor People's Campaign. For the 2 weeks before that, we were trying to work on the Fight for 15, calling the senator from West Virginia with testifiers from West Virginia. And so those are the kinds of things that you could be called in to do. Hopefully my chat tech is putting these links into the chat for you. And here are places to go for more information. The poorpeoplescampaign.org site has all kinds of information on it. There's no one YouTube channel. There's a Poor People's Campaign channel, a Repairers of the Breach channel, and a Kairos Center channel. So please check them all out. And there are things like playlists of movement songs and videos of our Moral Mondays or of lectures by our founders. And if you're interested in joining a working group, which I mentioned in the structure, faith leaders, outreach working group, legal working group, art, culture, theomusicology, speaker training, outreach and inclusion, policy and political education, or structure, write info at Poor People's Campaign. Oh, see, this is just for the Bay Area. So it's California Poor People's Campaign. This deck was originally done just for a local audience. I apologize to everybody from around the state. And my hour is up. I have a 4-minute video. So Nell, tell me whether I can go on.
Well, I think it would be good if folks had some time to reflect and meet each other. So
Okay.
everybody. I wonder if we should do
So one last slide. In the campaign, we say forward together, and folks respond, not one step back. So I know we're all muted, but at least we can do it once in our separate places. Forward together.
Not
one step back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Rowan, for that informative and inspiring presentation. And so, yeah, so thank you very much. And at this point, we want to set up some breakout rooms so people have a chance to just meet each other and offer your reflections on what you just experienced. So I'm gonna open the breakout rooms, and it looks like they've already begun. And then I have a link that I'm gonna drop for people to have questions, you know, kind of how to do the breakout groups. And we'll see you back in about 10 or 15 minutes.
I don't want to go in the breakout group. I don't either. How to do it.
Welcome back, everybody. Hey.
Hi, Nell.
Hi. So we have people are still coming back from the breakout rooms. Yeah.
I didn't get it. We were in the middle of a sentence.
Oops. I hate that. That's why I tried to give warning and then they give you 60 seconds, but you know.
We're talking. I had a wonderful time in the breakout room. It was great. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah.
How much longer is this gonna last, this presentation?
Well, we're just gonna do a little closing housekeeping, actually. So.
Okay, yeah, because I got another 5 o'clock.
Right. So thank you all for coming back into the main room. And we just want to take a few minutes to hear if there are any comments or questions you have that you want to pose to us at this point. And then we have an evaluation form that we'd like to ask you to complete to give us feedback, and also so that you can indicate if you're interested in joining a working group. And so I'll put that in the chat. So thoughts or comments at this point? And if I don't see you raising your hand, just go ahead and speak.
Well, I'll just say that I enjoyed my breakout, and I've been online a lot of times with the group, and I just am so excited about being a part of it, and want to, eventually work. As I was telling my group, I'm wearing a mask because I had dental surgery, so, but I'm hanging in here, and give me a month or so, and I'll be ready to get out.
Fantastic.
And yeah, so, and we were all from San Francisco, so I mean, I was born and raised in San Francisco, and all the people were a part of San Francisco, so that was awesome.
All right on. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, Art.
Thank you, Neil.
You're welcome.
Yeah, this was really a great orientation. And I wanted to know, does the Poor People's Campaign, I asked somebody who was in my breakout room, but maybe I'll ask you, is there a coalition? Are you in coalition with other groups, or is the Poor People's Campaign just its own organization and works alone?
No, well, we're not an organization. We're an organism. And the whole idea is that we don't need another organization. We need a movement. And so our work really is about, finding organizations, individuals, congregations who are interested in challenging those interlocking injustices in a moral fusion way. And there's a lot of history around change in this country. And the most significant progressive change has always come when people have come together across gender, across race, across age, across geography, across all the things that they use to divide us. And so, yeah, so the Poor People's Campaign is definitely interested in building with others. Any other questions or comments?
Petrushka?
Yeah, hi. Now, when I remember reading, I have a visual memory, and so I remember reading that the paid positions are Kairos Repair of the Breach and Poor People's Campaign. Is that right? Is that no?
And repairs.
Well, the Poor People's Campaign doesn't have anybody. It's the Kairos Center in New York and the Repairs of the Breach in North Carolina are the two organizations that came together to create the Poor People's Volunteer Organization.
Kairos with the K though, isn't it?
Yes.
Kairos.
Yeah, it was typed wrong. So Kairos organization I'm sorry, I'm dull right now. A second. Kairos and the Repairs of the Breach. Is that two different things?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Okay, so and so the San Francisco area, I really understand the word were organic, and I understand that alchemically, how we utilize, and there are different places, sign up for getting the AGs to pass this with Glenn Kirshner or whatever, we can pass on a lot of different things, but what I'm just having a hard time sort of trying to feel. I know I'm part of this group, and I know that I can be used well, and I have gifts to bring to it, but I don't know how to traverse that, because I'm also dealing with, my own SSI trying to get $10,000 from me because I went over $2,000 limit for a couple of years, for $100, it just hovered there. So they're trying to get it all back from me. So I'm dealing with, my own poverty stuff. And, we're living with that whole on SSDI and SSI stuff that's so low. And so I know that it's life. Yahai is one way to say it. Yahai, our life, concentrate on the life. And in other words, what can I give? What can I, while I'm still alive, how can I be useful? How can I, fertilize and have a tree come out of this movement and not just a bush, So who do I talk to about that in San Francisco, and how do I get involved with the people who are, actually setting events? I guess that's what I'm trying to say. How does that happen?
Well, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and as are some other people who are on the leadership team who organized this workshop. And so if you put your name and email in the chat, we'll have somebody reach out to you.
And you're in Santa Rosa area, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can do that. Also, in general, this is the first session, so I'd encourage you to go to the different links and read and learn more. And then also, if you look at the working groups, there's different working groups. So there's a faith leaders working group, and there's a policy working group, and see which of those might feel most appropriate to you. So that's another way for everybody. And again, just sort of ground yourself in the information and see what else is going on. And then, we sometimes when we're out of the lockdown, there may be more local regional actions. And then that'll be a little bit different. We're doing everything online right now, so it doesn't really matter where you live. But there are definitely folks in Santa Rosa that we could connect you to.
Wonderful. So the link that you'll send me will have those different groups that I can go to. That you said the religious group and different, that'll be able to be got to from the link when I type in something to San Francisco.
No.
Now,
actually, if you click on the form that I have in the chat, it will give you a place to indicate what working group you might be interested in.
Right.
And it's also a way to give us your contact info.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for being here.
I'm trying to come back.
I know. Okay, and so we are at about 5 minutes to 5, and I just want to acknowledge Reverend Rowan for your spectacular presentation of the history and the current Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and also acknowledge Mary Claire Newman for your excellent support of that effort to, come up with the presentation. And the welcome session has grown out of the speaker training working group, which is another working group that's an option for folks after, you've had some experience and gotten to know the campaign. If you're interested in becoming, a person who's trained to represent the campaign, then that's what the speakers training group does. But we recognize that, the campaign is growing. And so we wanted to create a way of welcoming people, giving them orientation around the history, an orientation around the current campaign, and then information about the structure and ways to get involved. And so we're hoping that, you'll give us some feedback on how we do, that we accomplish those things. You're always welcome to come back. We have these on the first Tuesday of the month. And so we'll be back in April on, we'll be back on the first Tuesday in April. I won't say what the date is. I think it's like the 5th. But we will be back. And in the meantime, we hope that you will be safe and well, and fill out the form, and we can connect you with people in your region. The Moral Monday on March 8th is going to be focused on International Women's Day, and so you'll be hearing more about that. And on March 15th, it will be focused on the state legislatures, because if you know the fundamental principles, there's a piece in there that talks about that the impact at the state level is really critical. And so the 40 days, which, was the launch of the campaign, was focused on state houses across the country. So we're going back to the state houses. And it's unclear whether we're going to all go to Sacramento or whether we're going to visit the legislators who are in who represent us in our regions. But definitely you'll be hearing more about that. And we hope that you'll join us for Moral Monday. Okay. And so thank you all. Any last thoughts, questions, or comments?
No.
One thing I'll just add, one thing I mentioned, and I just want to put it out there, that sexism is not being spoken about much. And it's Barbara definitely acknowledges that women are the most the grandest population, and it would be wonderful if that could be part of the racism and the poverty, of the isms that are talked about. I think we need to get out of the shadow and have that come forward.
Thank you. And I invite you to put that on the feedback form. Thank you so much. Okay. All right, everybody.
Now,
Anne has a question.
Is each month different, or is it just a repeat of this program?
Well, this program is in development, but fundamentally it's a welcome session that is, we're working on, it'll be slightly different, but it's fundamentally going to be the history, the current PPC structure, how to get involved, because the idea that as new people come, we want them to have that information, and then assuming that they'll join working groups, join us for activities, events, meetings, actions, right? But that when people are new to the PPC, we want them to get a kind of fundamental orientation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just quickly, Anne, also, we've been considering making this a 2-hour event, or have a introductory session. So if you've already come to the introductory, then we could have a separate time afterward to keep connected and answer questions and see what people are doing, what they'd like to do. So we'd like feedback on that also, that if you would want to come. We've thought about making this into a 3 or 4 session thing. We're just trying to figure out what's going to work best for most people. That if we have because as you can see, there's a lot of material to cover, and it's hard to condense that and get the full, all the information that people need. So if you're interested in that, please let us know. Also, for some of you, there is a role as testifiers, that if you're an impacted person, that you can speak about your experience and what's happening. And that's another thing we're very interested in, speaking to having people, not just to do the speaking like Reverend Rowan did today, but if you are an impacted person who could speak at, rallies or at events and things like that, we'd want to know that too. Thank you.
All righty. And so with that, Reverend Ron, do you want to lead us again in Forward Together?
Lead us again in what, please?
Forward Together.
Oh, Forward Together.
Not
one step back.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you all for joining, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.
3 to 5, 3:30, 90 minutes.
Mhm.
Mm. Did we lose Mason?
Looks like. Good job. You put them all in the waiting room.
Mhm. You know,
I
some
was just about to do the same thing.
you know,
Great
people
minds.
walk away from their computers or whatever. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, both of you, for that spectacular presentation. Yeah.
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 Really.
Mary Claire really tightened up or loosened up the slides so that they have less information on them.
Mhm. Mhm.
I did ask the 2 people that were in I only had 2 people in my breakout room.
Right. Well, we
Yeah, there were
lost a
only
lot
3
of
people in
when-
ours too.
We
Okay.
lost a lot of people when we went into breakouts, you know, which is not unusual,
Okay.
you know.
Yeah, well, she said she loved it. It was a good orientation and production. She's in other groups and she's always looking for ways to do this kind of orientation thing. She said it was a lot of information. It was wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So yeah,
Great.
and that just, I know, you know, there's some tweaks we can give to the script and all that. I think it's going to be important. I don't know if we have all your transitions written, but those transitions are important from one section to another in one slide. So some things you just can't say because you know what's coming and things like that. But if somebody's not really versed in all of it, we would want to have the actual, it's like, okay, now we're going to talk about such and such. And like
I think
that.
they're mostly in the script.
Yeah,
I think they're mostly in the
I think
script.
so too. You know, there's a couple places where we could still do we could still cut some of the slides a little bit, but basically, yeah, I think I thought it went off really well. I think it would be good to explore the idea of having somebody else, like you would do, you know, somebody would do the first part, and then now Mason's going to tell you about today's campaign, you know, just having different speakers in general is good. And
Well, I thought Mason was going to do the whole thing next time.
Okay. Yeah, well, I just think breaking it up with different speakers is just generally, it keeps people's interest more a little bit, you know.
Yeah.
But we, you know, that's like, hey, this is only our second time, right?
Mhm. And it's a work in progress. So, you know,
Yeah.
it is a work in progress. So, yeah.
And just that of what do we do now? I think that's still, you know, I think that was great. You said Moral Mondays. I think, you know, if we have more answers, it's like, well, the next thing is if you'll come to this on Moral Monday, and if you'll, you know, here's these 2 things you can do. Because there's so much, you know, like there's so many on that sheet that if we can give them like, here's 3 things that are coming up. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the fellow who put his name in the chat, who's from the KPFA Advisory Council, they're about to do a community, I don't remember how he talked about it, community assessment of their area. And they'd really like to have the cooperation of the Poor People's Campaign to help them find out what poor people want to hear on the radio. So he was in my breakout group and he left his information in the chat, but I also gave him your email address and my email address now so that he can get straight to us, as I think that sounds like a pretty important connection to make.